It's really great to have this opportunity to connect with you, to continue our work developing the Acuity scale. And some of you have participated in the previous testing of the Acuity scale. This is the final testing to finalize the work that we've been doing. What you see on your screen right now is a very brief summary of what the scale is all about. You will also receive that in the documentation after the webinar today. So essentially, for those of you who are not familiar, we've been working in the second stage shelter project since 2013 with second stage shelter directors, which all of you shelter directors that represent your shelters, and they were quite actively participating in the development of the scale. So the decision of that committee was that it was really important to have some kind of a way for second stage shelters to understand the complexity of issues that women are dealing with when they come to the second stage shelter. And the purpose of that is for us to speak to the kind of complexity that we're working with, but also, of course, to inform service delivery. You can see that in this page that I've shown you an overview of scoring, which we are going to finalize once the testing is complete. At this point, the scale has 28 scale items, and each is scored on a scale of 0, 3, or 5, and that's just to give us a way of distinguishing lower, middle, and higher scoring results. The actual testing idea is at this point to look at the case studies that we will be sending to you and to score the case studies. So it won't be a real person, but the case studies will describe the person. And we will talk today about the actual scale and how to use it, as well as how to go through the case studies and score them. So that's the introduction, and Susan, just before we go looking at the scale itself, just to give you an opportunity to add anything to what I just said.
I think the most important thing, once you do receive the case studies, is to review them independently. So we ask that you're not discussing them with each other, and to read through them very carefully first before going back and maybe going through it a second time to complete the Acuity scale.
Okay, that's great, and we'll talk more about the detailed completion as well at the end. So let's move on to the first page of the Acuity scale. And again, as Ali had indicated earlier, as you have a question, please raise your hand or type it in so that we can answer those when we will be stopping. So what I'm planning on doing is going page by page. So we have a total of 4 or 5 pages, so we'll have an opportunity to then take time and address your questions. So you can see when you get this Acuity scale, you will just complete it by hand. You will just write in your name. You will circle the case study number. There will be 2 case studies, so when you do the case study 1, you'll circle 1. When you do case study 2, you'll circle 2. Put the name of your shelter and the date when you completed the Acuity scale. So the scale is divided into categories. The first one is a category of safety, and that is comprised of 3 criteria, I guess. One is the risk of femicide. You know, what's the likelihood that the woman is going to be killed by her partner? Second is the level of violence. And third is how well she's engaged, or to what degree is she engaged in staying safe. So just going through each one of those, risk of femicide is a simply fairly simple, it's danger assessment score. So I believe all of you are completing the danger assessment in your shelters. So you have to, when we actually do this with real clients, you would just use the score from the danger assessment. You can also see it says WTPT danger assessment, what that is the Walking the Path Together danger assessment, which just some of you use and some of you don't. It is a more culturally sensitive assessment for Indigenous women. And you can use either one. So, Susan, did you have anything to add about the risk of femicide score?
Only to stress how important it is to use the danger assessment, and just to reinforce that all shelter directors agreed that using the danger assessment would be an important part of this project. And so I can't stress that enough, how important it is. And I know some of you have both an emergency shelter and a second stage shelter, and so will often receive the danger assessment from the emergency shelter. And so we were asking that you use that for the second stage, and probably, and if you need to review it with the woman, that would be important in second stage as well.
And at this point, so that's great, Susan, and that does speak to using the Acuity scale when we actually finish the testing, and we're doing it with real people. At this point, to complete this particular scale, you will receive the case studies, and the case studies will actually give you the score. So that would be one of the easiest things to complete. So if you have a score of 7 or less, that's written in the case study, you will assign a score of 0, and you'll put it right in here in the enter score spot. If the score is between 8 and 13, 8 to 13, then you would put score 3 here. And then if a score is 14 or more, then you put score 5 here. So moving on, so level of violence. So here we want to understand how severe the violence is, and of course we all know that physical violence is often as bad as emotional, verbal, or psychological violence, but we also know that having a combination of all those types increases the complexity. So if you're seeing no physical violence but other types of violence present, then you will give it a score of 0. A score of 3 would then be increasing the level of violence, where there is the other emotional, verbal, or psychological violence, may include financial abuse, may include stalking, but then there's also physical violence, although it's not frequent, and we've defined it very specifically here for you: slapping, pushing, kicking, but not leading to physical injuries. And then score of 5, of course, includes physical violence. So one of the things to mention here is that as you're looking at the case studies, what we ask you to do is not assume or read into the case study more than what's already there. That it is a different way of assessing things than what you do with somebody who is actually in your shelter. So just please read the case study and see what it says, and do not assume other than what is already in it. Susan, any additions?
No, I think you've explained it well.
Okay. Engaged in staying safe. So here we're talking about woman's willingness, I guess, or being in a place where she's ready to really work to keep herself safe and her children safe. And this might be a kind of a clinical perspective that might be important to understand. But the score of 0, which means no complexity here, she is actively engaged in keeping herself or her children safe. So what does that mean? She's engaging with professionals. She sees her partner as accountable rather than making excuses for his behavior. She's actively engages in safety planning, and she sees value in safety planning. She also seeks sanctions for his abuse of her. So that would be a score of 0. A score of 3, where she might have some of that kind of engagement, but there's a questioning. She's not quite sure. And Susan, you can help me out a little bit with making that distinction here as well. But she might not be quite sure exactly, well, is it him or is it me? You know, oh, should I engage authority? Well, I still want him in my life. She might see some value in safety planning, but not maybe completely. And some days maybe she's engaged and some days she isn't. And the score of 5, which is highest complexity, is where she's not willing at all to engage in safety planning. She denies the abuse and maybe takes it all on herself, does not want to engage. There's a lot of fear and mistrust, and maybe does not see value in safety planning. And just to say something about this, we're not judging here. we really just want to understand where she's at in her progress or process and how we can best help her.
Right, and so when you're reading the case studies, we're hoping that you'll be able to pick up on that through the case studies. And we know that in real life, when you're working with women, many women are probably would be score 3. Many women where that sitting on the fence, one day they're really keen to move on and see their partner as being responsible, but then the next day may feel some doubts about that. So it should be fairly clear where women are at as you read the case studies.
Okay, so I think I'm going to do one more page, and then we're going to ask, give you guys an opportunity for questions. Yeah. This is how you do it. Okay, so poverty and economic issues, of course, sorry about this, I'm just trying to center this so you can see it best. Okay, one more time. Okay, so of course we know how important financial situation is to someone negotiating where they're at with respect to leaving abusive situation. And you can see there are 4 key elements related to poverty that your shelter directors, when they participated in development of the scale, had identified as critical. First is the financial situation. So here we are not really looking at, you know, how much money they make or what the source of money is. It really is about a woman's assessment and also your assessment, joint assessment, of where their financial situation is at. So in some of these instances, it might not be black and white. So it does require some thinking and conversation. But with case studies, I think you'll probably see it fairly straightforward. So a score of 0 is no concerns at all, or a low level of concern that does not require shelter assistance. So what that means is adequate income is available or is about to become available. So this is the key piece here, is the requirement of shelter assistance. So this is really important to note. You will see that in many other components where we're not necessarily talking about presence or absence of the issues, but more about how well those issues are managed and what amount of work is required on shelter end. So more support by shelter means more complexity. So that's what you see here. The score of 3 would be moderate concern. So she has some financial resources, but they may not be fully adequate. She does require some staff assistance to establish the income level that she needs, but it's not significant, and she may have some employment history. So number 5, then, the most complex, would be very serious concerns. So there's no income or very low income, no resources, no employment history, low education, no eligibility for requirements. So that is the kind of the end of the continuum. Did you want to add something, Susan, about this one?
Again, so when you're reading the case studies, this information should be included in the case studies. Again, and when you're dealing with women in your shelters, so actual clients, you'll have the opportunity to explore that further.
Yeah. Okay, so education, I think that's fairly straightforward. I understand that sometimes people, that's one of the questions that people don't share right away when you first see them. Again, when we're talking about a case study, it's pretty straightforward. You will see concrete answers to that. When the Acuity scale actually gets implemented in real life, then it might take more than, well, it usually does take more than just one meeting or one conversation to get at all of the information that you might be interested in, and education might be one of those instances. So when you're speaking with a real client, you might have to wait for about a month or so before you actually get this information. Essentially, we're looking at a score of 0 or no complexity would be someone has high school education minimally. That's really the cutoff. And they may also have some post-secondary, or they may have completed post-secondary. So from the perspective of complexity, completing high school education is where the score of 0 is going to be. So moving on now, score of 3 would be has had some high school but had not graduated and doesn't have any trade, technical, or other post-secondary training. And then the final score of 5, the most complex, would mean that somebody had not even started high school, essentially is what that is. Okay, so another, English and basic literacy is another indicator of poverty. So all of these pieces is what contributes to good or not so good financial situation. So here we're looking, in number 6, we're looking at both English as a second language capacity, so somebody who might be a newcomer to Canada and has not yet learned English, but it could also mean somebody who is native to Canada but just does not have the literacy skills that they need to maybe interact, read, etc. And we want to get at both of those things in this particular question. So a score of 0 is able to speak and read English without difficulty, no translator required, no issue with basic literacy. Score of 3 is you have some problems in either one of those. So for newcomers, they might be having difficulties with having themselves understood, or speak limited English, but not read it. They might also have little conversation, a little comprehension of English, but they would not require an interpreter. So somebody who is not a newcomer and has problems with literacy, that might mean that, you know, they might be able to read, but they have a hard time comprehending what they've read. And you are sensing that they might have some issues completing forms. And so number 5 would mean there is a translator who is required for comprehension of oral and written English. So there isn't, we didn't put anything related to literacy, number 5, because we don't expect that people would not be able to speak or understand if they're native born. Additions? No. Okay, so transportation is another very important element related to poverty and finances. And access, as you know, to transportation is very important for women in the shelter so that they can move forward to maybe go to appointments or find a job or do all of those things that they have to do when they are in second stage shelter. So a score of 0 would be has access to her own vehicle whenever required. Maybe her vehicle, but also could be friend's vehicle. The main point here is they have access to a vehicle at any time. So then if we move on to 3 now, there's some barriers in place meaning they don't have their own car, or the access to their own car is sporadic, but they can access public transportation. And then a score of 5, there's no consistent access to either public or personal transportation. So I think, Susan, did you have it?
Yeah. I guess the only thing I would say about the 5, so some women may have challenges using public transportation. That may result to scoring someone with a 5. They
So
just
disability.
Their disability, you're just, yeah, they can't comprehend how to use the public transportation system.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think I'm just going to stop here and Ellie give maybe a minute or 2 for people to maybe write out some questions if they have so far. So we've covered three important pieces. One was the acuity scale in general and what we're doing, why we're doing this now. You might have some questions about it and what the acuity scale is in general. Also, we talked about the safety component and the questions there, and then the poverty piece and the questions there. So you should feel comfortable now understanding what each one of those meant and with going forward and scoring if you need to. So I'll just give a minute or two for people to possibly write things down, and if we don't get anything in a couple of minutes, we'll just move forward. Okay, well, maybe we should proceed. Oh, sorry.
Sorry to interrupt. We've got 2 questions that just came through.
Oh, okay. Great.
So Karen asks, most shelters provide bus tickets through Donate a Ride. If not in shelter, the women may not be able to access public transportation. Would this be a 3 or a 5?
So it would be a 5. Because if you're already doing something for the woman, obviously you're having to put in shelter resources to support her. So you have to score it based on what would happen if there weren't any shelter resources in place, right? And that and you actually need to put something in to address the issue. So I would say if she doesn't have any access to transportation and the shelter needs to provide that access, then that would be a 5. Susan? Yes?
I agree.
Okay, yeah.
And we have another question from Kristen. What would you scale someone on B6 if they could speak English but couldn't write it very well? A 3 or 5? Or sorry, couldn't write English.
Yeah, I'd say a 3 because they can speak it, so translator might not be required, but there are still issues with writing.
And one more from Natalie. Would financial situation be 0 if they're on Alberta Works Assistance?
Well, so that's actually I think maybe a more challenging question for me. Again, why we didn't go to the amount of income on this is based on people's feedback to us from directors and also staff that sometimes the amount of income is not what determines how women feel about their financial situation. So they might have Alberta Works, and some of us might say, well, boy, that's not enough. I would have a significant concern. But for some women, that might be okay because she has some maybe additional supports in place. So it's really about her assessment of how much her financial situation is a concern, rather than what the sources of income are and how much money she's making. So you will see that fairly clear in the case studies, but when you actually start talking to the women, it should come out in a conversation about how much of a concern does she have. So if she has no concerns, she might be on Alberta Works, she has no concerns and she feels she can manage it, then it's a 0. If she's on Alberta Works, but has moderate concern. She's saying, well, I think I can manage it, but if something comes up, next month, boy, I might be in a difficult situation. Well, that's a 3. And then she might, again, still be on Alberta Works and say, there's no way I can live on this. I have nothing else. This is not enough with my, 3, 4, 5 kids and the housing that I have, so I have a significant financial concern. Okay.
Thanks, Irene. That's all the questions for now.
Okay, excellent questions. That's fantastic. Thank you very much. So please put those more questions forward as we go along. And again, I'll do 2 more windows, and then we'll stop and have some more questions. If I can move this in the way it works. Okay, so this next piece is supports in place. So now we're talking about how much support does the woman have, and we're looking at both the personal, informal supports, professional supports, and you can see the length of time in Canada or off reserve. That's really speaking to those people who are new in a place they're living. Obviously, that would be an additional complexity. So looking at personal informal supports. So now what we're trying to get at is not just the number of supports or who they are, and in fact, primarily not the number, but mostly it's about the perception of whether or not those supports are positive. Right? So you could have lots of people around you, but not give you positive supports. So then the score of 0 means supports are in place and then include family or friends that are always or almost always available. So we know nobody can always be available. So that's why we kind of hedged it a little bit there. But those are supports that are generally perceived as positive. Kind of overview, overall, they're generally perceived as positive. So they offer positive advice, they have reasonable expectations, they speak to the woman in her best interest and encouraging positive behaviors. So, someone might be having drug addictions, and if she has friends, they encourage continued use of drugs, and she might really like them, but those are not positive friends. Anyway, score of 0 is that we don't have any of that negative influence happening for her. Score of 3, that you do have some presence of that, but also you do have some positive supports, but they may not be consistently present, or they may not be consistently positive, right? They might be really positive and encouraging one day, but not so great the next day. And then score of 5 means overall, no, there's the supports might be there, but they're not available, they're not positive, they're unreliable, they encourage negative behaviors overall. So again, when we're looking at the case studies, it'll be fairly straightforward. When you're working with actual people, it's not always straightforward, and it does require some time for you to get to know somebody. And that's why, as you know, we always talk about intake process taking way longer than just a day or 2 days or a week even. And we talk about a week, probably about a month before you can gather all the needed information and you can understand the perspectives. So now professional supports. Here we're looking at whether or not the supports are available and whether or not they're effective for the woman. So we all know that first of all, sometimes it's very difficult to access needed supports, and that's possible. But there are other times when we can access needed supports, but they're not very effective, or there's significant barriers in them, or a woman has to fight with bureaucracy to get what she needs. So that's not really an effective support. So a score of 0 means all the support. So first of all, one of the possibilities is that no professional supports may be required, right? So there's no complexity there. Another possibility is the supports are required and all of them are in place and they are being effective, and the woman is using them, right? Because sometimes we have women who may not be ready to engage. So in the score of 0, it means, you know, they're engaged, they're effective, they're in place. Score of 3 is again, well, let me actually go to the score of 5, because that's the other end of the continuum. So that means that professional supports are needed, so there's a need for them, but none are in place, or they might be in place, but none are addressing the needs that are there, or there's no plan in place to put the supports in, to get the supports in place, or the woman may refuse to engage. So essentially what this means is that shelter needs to do a whole lot of work to get professional supports to become more effective or engaged, or work with a woman to get her to understand or see the value of those supports. And now the score of 3 is in the middle of that. So maybe the referrals have been made, but no contacts have been established. Or maybe professional supports are in place, but they're not fully effective. Or maybe additional supports are required and they haven't begun to provide support. And the woman would probably be open to making linkages with those supports. So,
well, what Irina said before about many of these different items is when you're looking at professional supports as we move along the continuum, a woman that would score 5 would be someone that would require a fair amount of work on the behalf of the shelter staff to work with that woman to ensure that those supports are in place and addressing the needs that she has.
mm-hmm. Okay, so then length of time in Canada or off reserve. So initially we just had length of time in Canada for newcomers. But then through the conversation with your shelter directors, they had said, you know, this is also relevant to the Indigenous women, because living on reserve is also living in a different culture, obviously, and not as kind of in mainstream Canada. And also when you leave the reserve, then you lose all that support network that you might have developed. So that's why we put both of those here. The time off reserve is a little bit complicated because we know women can come and go to reserves. So when we are seeing that, what we'd like you to do is look at her most recent time that she left the reserve. So if she has left the reserve, most recently she might have left the reserve a year ago, or most recently she might have left it 3 years ago, but there might have been other times that she had left and come back. So that's important to remember. So then the score of 0 would be to someone who is born in Canada and is not an Aboriginal person who might potentially be living on a reserve. Or this person is a newcomer but has lived in Canada for over 3 years. So which means they've established, you know, based on literature, we know that 3 years is the time when they probably have established some supports. Or this woman is Aboriginal, but she has lived off reserve the last time she left for over 3 years, or she has never lived on reserve. So that's a lot of, I guess, qualifications here. But the main thing is, what we're trying to get at is how long has someone been away from the place where they had really strong support network and living in a different culture. That's essentially what we're doing. So a score of 3, the person is a newcomer and has lived in Canada between 1 and 3 years, or the person is Aboriginal and has lived off reserve between 1 and 3 years. And then the score of 5, this is now for less than 1 year for both groups. Okay, so yeah, I think I'll move to the next one, and if people can think of questions about this one, please send them forward and we'll address them when we're done the next slide. So the next one is housing stability. Oh. So there's just 2 questions here. We're talking about housing prior to admission to your second stage shelter. So, Susan, oftentimes you speak to the fact that in most instances, many women come to second stage shelter from the emergency shelter. So for many women in your shelter, the score would be 5 for the D11. But you will see the case studies are going to be a little different, so you have to read carefully through them and not make the assumptions. So a score of 0 for type of housing would be woman living in permanent housing prior to admission of the shelter. So that would be in those odd circumstances when woman is not in a second stage shelter, maybe, sorry, in an emergency shelter. So maybe she lived in an emergency shelter and then she left there, and then maybe she actually ended up living somewhere else before she then came back to second stage because she couldn't stay living in the community. So 0 means she's living in permanent housing, what does that mean exactly? It could be rented or owned. It may or may not include support services. She may or may not receive financial assistance, or the housing might be subsidized. The important thing here is that there's no limit to how long the woman can stay in this type of housing. So if she had that type of housing immediately prior to moving into second stage shelter, then you would give her a score of 0. A score of 3 would be now if somebody is living in a transitional or temporary housing. So maybe they were actually in another second stage shelter, and that second stage shelter couldn't provide the services that they needed, or maybe she moved to a different place. So then that would give her a score of 3. Or it could be a health facility of some kind where wasn't a short-term health facility, but a longer kind of health facility. So again, this is what the statement is down there at the bottom. This is usually a longer-term, service-intensive, but time-limited housing with stays of 3 months to 3 years. Okay, that would be the score of 3. And the score of 5 would be a woman is living in an emergency shelter, for example, which is going to be quite often the case with women in second stage shelters. Or she might be, couch surfing. So for example, she might have been in an emergency shelter, but then couldn't stay there any longer because of the time limits. And then she went and lived with her parents. That wasn't a feasible situation. Then she went to live with, then she went to go to second stage shelter. So her immediate housing prior to moving into second stage would have been living with couch surfing with family or friends. So that would get a score of 5. Or if she was homeless, that would also get a score of 5. Or if it's a housing, note that we added here, housing that's unsuitable for human habitation. So sometimes when you get a permanent housing, but you cannot live there because it's just not safe. So that would also get a score of 5. Okay. So number of times moved residence. So this could be a little confusing because people are saying, well, what do you mean prior, in the year prior? What does that exactly mean? Does that mean times she moved from one house to another, or what does that mean? Anyway, so what we're talking about is them just leaving one type of dwelling and going to another type of dwelling. So for example, in our example of a woman that maybe had been at a second stage shelter and then went, emergency shelter, then went to live with her parents and then went to second stage shelter, that would be one time that she had moved before coming to the second stage. So the actual move to the second stage does not count.
Do you want to repeat that? Because I was thinking it was 2.
Okay, yeah,
So she went into emergency shelter, then to her parents, then to second stage.
Okay, yeah, so sorry, yeah. So if what I was thinking of, not a period of a year is an important consideration here, but yeah. So let's say we'll take 1 year and we'll say January 2016 would be the, so let's say she's trying to get into the shelter on January 1st of 2017. So what we then do is we look back to January 1st of 2016 to see how many times she moved. Okay, so let's say she got into an emergency shelter in 2015, and she left there in, say, March of 2016 and went living with her parents. And then she lived with her parents between March of 2016 and January of 2017, at which point she had now came into the second stage shelter. So what that means, she actually moved physically once, right, in that 1 year. Okay, I hope that's clear. If not, please, write your questions. Then we use the same kind of formula. Number 3, score of 3 would be moved residences 2 to 3 times. So now she could have been in the same year. Let's say she was in emergency shelter in 2015, left emergency shelter, moved in with her partner, let's say in February of 2016, then moved to her parents in, say, April of 2016, and then came to second stage shelter in January of 2017. She's had 2 moves in that period of time, right? One from the emergency shelter to her partner, and one from her partner to parents. And then moved residences 4 or more times in the year prior to shelter, we would add another move to somewhere else in that same situation. So I think I'll stop here and give people a little bit of time, Allie, to write questions. And Allie, I'll just wait for you to let me know when we can continue.
So far we've got 2 questions and a comment. Debbie's comment is about is it a woman may have left reserve for over 3 years but have no supports as she has moved frequently?
Yes. Say again?
Debbie's comment is, a woman may have left reserve for over 3 years but have no supports as she's moved frequently. Debbie, I've unmuted you if you'd like to speak to that a little bit more.
Sorry, I was munching. I'm eating while I'm listening. Yeah, I'm just thinking that if a woman has been off of reserve, she could be off of reserve for even 4 or 5 years. But if she's had periods where she's moving a lot, so she moves from one community to another, or she's homeless, or she moves from one relationship to another, she may have very few actual supports. So although she'll have been off reserve for over 3 years, she still has no supports available to her.
Yeah, so you're really looking at 2 issues there, are you not, Debbie?
Probably. I think that with number 10, it seems that we would, because she's been off of reserve, we'd score a 0. But when you come down to number 11 and 12, you've got different scores for that same woman.
And that's certainly okay to have different scores in the different areas.
Mm-hmm. I think it would bias it a bit, though, because I think that if she's lived off reserve for that long and has no supports, she should have a higher score.
Yeah, and so this is where the number 8 gets at personal and formal supports.
Right.
Right. So we are going to give her a score of 5 right there.
Mm-hmm.
And then the number 10 just adds that little bit, because if she's only been off reserve for a short period of time, that score of 5 of personal and formal supports becomes even worse.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
But what you're saying, Debbie, is that on the number 10, she would score a 0.
Mm-hmm.
Which is okay. She's going to score a 5 on the supports. And then you were talking about 11 and 12?
Yes, just that because it's where she was immediately prior to the admission and how many times she had moved in the previous year. So I can see she'd get high scores there.
Right.
But I'm just thinking if we're looking at, where she is in reality with the acuity scale, it seems to me that that number 10 does seem to indicate a much lower score than is her lived experience.
Right, and that's why it's so important to look at each one of these issues and to score them.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I understand your concern.
It's just that someone who maybe has had these kinds of frequent moves, right?
Mm-hmm.
And has a really a weak support network, but would be a little bit less complex than a person who has all that, plus has only been off reserve for a year.
Okay.
Right, so that just adds that little bit more.
Yeah. Okay. I actually think that it adds more complexity because, you know, if she's been, you know, homeless or living in you know, couch surfing or something like that, then
Right.
you know, and just because she's off of reserve for more than 3 years, that's
Yeah.
an odd thing to put as a 0 score.
Yeah, well, but you still have a way to measure that, like we have number of
Yeah.
times moved, right? So she'll
Yeah.
get a high score there.
Yes.
So we are looking, it's not, you know, not any one question
Yeah.
is the overall score,
No, no.
right?
I'm
We're really,
thinking that when you get to the bottom, you know, instead of having, say, I don't know, 45, she'll end up with 40, you know, or if you get to the bottom and it's 25, you know, instead of 30, you know,
that's
that's all.
right, and that's why, and so all of those things you're mentioning are really important.
Mhm.
So the lack of supports is really important, which we got in number 8, right?
Yeah.
And the number of times that she moves of residence and being unstable that way, we also have in number 12.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we
Thank
have
you.
all of those things, right? But Debbie, I don't want you to kind of go away feeling that, you know, we are interested in your feedback. So we are noting what you're suggesting, and the scale, even though we've kind of stopped changing it at this point,
Mm-hmm.
you know, just for temporarily, at least until we finish this testing process, we are
Yeah.
going to note everyone's feedback. And,
Yes.
you know, in the testing you're going to do for us, you will see in the form that allows you an opportunity to provide more feedback.
Oh,
Right?
that's good.
You know, so what you're saying, I mean, we did try to address what you're talking about, but, you know, I'm not saying we're not going to consider it at all. So it's just, it's a good a suggestion, and we do need to think about it. And this is for everyone also to please provide us with any suggestions or thoughts so that we can continue to improve the scale.
Yeah, I think as long as there's a place for feedback, then it makes it more accurate because then you can add something in there in feedback that says, while this score was, these are other circumstances that are occurring in this woman's life.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Thanks, Debbie.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Debbie. There's a question from Natalie about the professional supports.
Okay.
So on the professional supports, all supports are in place, but the woman does not effectively or reschedule often. What score is this?
I would give it a 3, right? Because she's not engaging, right? Yeah, we may want to make that a little bit clearer. So maybe we can say here, is the woman
Not consistently.
is not consistently engaging. Or the woman.
Natalie, does that address the question?
I've unmuted you, Natalie, if that addresses it. Yes, it does.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Natalie.
Okay. We have another question about professional supports. When talking about professional supports, are you including second stage staff as professional support? If this is the case, would a score of 0 for that category be irrelevant for most of our women?
No, we're not including the second stage shelter staff. That's an important distinction to make. This is what her needs are without second stage shelter support yet in place. So hypothetically, when she comes in at intake, she has no second stage shelter support, but we want to understand how much of that she needs. And if she needs a significant amount of professional support that is facilitated through the shelter, then we would put her as 5.
Thank you. For number 10, length of time in Canada. What if a woman has been in Canada 3+ years, but due to domestic violence, they are so isolated they aren't aware of Canadian culture / haven't adjusted? In this case, should they be scored higher, or should this information be captured somewhere else?
Yeah, good question. So information should be captured somewhere else. So you have to look at each of these questions as a unique question getting at different things. So for example, when you're completing your intake, right, and you have 10 questions there, one would be her age, one would be her education, one would be her employment, etc. Well, you could have very low education but very good employment, and so both of those could be true. So what we want to do is answer each question exactly as what is being asked, right? So if the professional supports are inconsistent or poor, then we give them 5. But if they have been in Canada for more than 5 years or 3 years, sorry, then we give them 0. So that's just a separate question, and it might not be. She might still have a lot of other issues, and we are getting at those other issues elsewhere in the scale. This particular question just adds that little bit more to the complexity.
And there's a similar comment. I find that newcomers to Canada are usually quite isolated, even if they have been in Canada for longer than 3 years. In some cases, they just moved to Canada and do not have supports. Literacy is quite challenged, etc. So the comment is that they would be scored higher, but I think you just addressed that in that would be captured elsewhere.
That's right. Yeah, we just want to make sure we answer each individual question. So each question gets at a particular element of complexity. It is not looking at getting more than just what it's asking. So we want to answer each one specifically. Yeah. And of course, if we're missing something in terms of a question that is needed in addition to what's here that would get at additional complexity, please do let us know. Okay.
That's addressed all the questions we have so far.
Okay, great.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent questions, by the way. All right, so this next one is women's mental health, wellness, and trauma. So I think what we'll do is I won't do 2 at this case. I'm just going to do this 1 page, and then we'll open it up for questions. So if you want to start shooting your questions, that'd be great. So those are all elements that the shelter directors identified as adding to the overall mental health, wellness, or trauma that women are experiencing. First is abused as a child. So obviously either experience or witness of abuse as a child is traumatic. And if none of that happened, that's a score of 0. If any of that happened, that's a score of 5. You will see that there's no score of 3 because there's no in between really here. So it's either 0 or 5 in this particular question. She either experienced it or witnessed it, or she didn't. Number of abusive relationships. So what this means is prior to the one abusive relationship that she's currently experiencing, have there been others? And so that's just, again, that's similar to that question that we had about on reserve, etc., where, you know, we might say, well, you know, it might be just one abusive relationship, but it's really horrific and really traumatic. So, of course, that can happen. And what we're trying to get at in other places is what her mental health is and suicide risk and all of those other things in other questions. And what we're saying here is even having more than one relationship adds that little bit more of a complexity. So if she's had no abusive relationships prior to the one that precipitated the current admission, then the score would be 0. If she's had 1, then the score would be 3. And if she's had 2 or more, then the score would be 5. Okay? So mental health concerns. So now this is, I know that this is a difficult question because we certainly do not expect the staff to be, you know, psychiatrists assessing mental health issues and diagnosing people. This is not what that question is about. This is really more about what woman reports to you and what you might observe, and you just have a sense of. So there is never going to be a definitive for sure I know or for sure I don't know, but I suspect. So that's what we're looking at in this question. And when we talk about mental health concerns, we're talking about all possible issues that you might see or come across with too. And of course we see a lot of women in shelters, probably a majority of them, who have been experiencing trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and depression. For sure, those come very frequently. But then others might have some more serious, maybe diagnosed issues that they can come in with and tell you about. So score of 0, she doesn't report any of that, and staff members do not observe any. Score of 3, yes, there's some reporting of it, but those concerns do not require any additional support from program staff. Okay, so what that means is that the impact of those issues might be fairly low, or it's managed really well, and you don't need to do anything to support her in that. But there's something present, okay? And score of 5, that there are some concerns, but they do require support. So whether or not it's your support or it's referrals and engaging other professionals, or something within a shelter that you have to do differently to support this woman, that would be a score of 5. Suicide risk. So again, this is not a formal assessment, as I've said, but it is something that women might personally report to you, or you might have observed, or you might have some kind of reason to suspect that there might be a suicide risk. So score of 0, there's no report of that, there's no reason to suspect, and you do not know of any history of suicide attempts. Remember, when in the case study, you'll have it pretty clear. Again, when you're working with a real person, it might take time to find out what her situation is. A score of 3, a woman reports a history of suicide attempts, but there's no current suicide ideation, which means plans or attempts. So what that means, current meaning within the last year, within the year before her coming to the shelter. And then score of 5, the highest complexity is if there is a presence of suicide ideation or some kind of an attempt within the last year. And that's a score of 5. So so addiction. Again, same as mental health and suicide risk. This is not specific, not black and white. That does talk to suspecting or your perception. So the woman does not personally report that she has, and staff members have not observed any reason to suspect a currently active addiction. So, Susan, what would be some, what would make you think about suspecting an addiction? I'll let you answer maybe in a little while, if you want. Yeah. And there might be a history of previous successfully treated addiction, but there is no longer addiction in place. That's a score of 0. So a score of 3 is there is some kind of addiction in place, but it's well managed or treated. And the score of 5 is there is addiction in place now, but it is untreated and it requires support or management from shelter staff. So staff have to do something to support women through this process.
And in the case studies, it should be fairly clear with these women if they have addiction issues. For women coming into your shelter, I mean, it's probably not something you're going to ask within the first few days, but it is something when I'm looking at the suicide risk as well as addiction that we do encourage when you're preparing to do the danger assessment to look at a woman's coping strategies and look at ways that she may have unhealthy coping strategies. So it may be something that is part of your work in shelter anyway. And the last question on the danger assessment is about risk of suicide. So it's there, and it's about just exploring with women, how I often would say to women, that sometimes women, when they're struggling with feeling overwhelmed or sad about the situation, may tend to drink a little bit more or sometimes use medication, prescription drugs more than they should. Has that ever happened with you, or is that something you're concerned about? So you can ask it in a gentle way and kind of almost not normalizing it or not okaying it, but just make it sound like she wouldn't be alone if that's something that she's struggling with. So to make it safe for her to acknowledge that she may be struggling with those kinds of things.
Great, that's great. Thank you, Susan. So Ali, I think we should stop here. And wait for maybe some questions on this particular slide or comments.
Sure, that sounds good.
Do we have any yet?
Not as of yet.
Okay.
I think you're probably okay to move on, and then if there's any that can come up, we can address them in the next question session.
Okay. Okay, so the next item is physical health. So number 18 speaks to any kind of physical health conditions that the woman may have. And again, there could be physical health conditions, obviously, that you might not be aware of, and that's fine. I mean, obviously, we want to find out as much as we can, but sometimes we might not know it until, you know, even a year later into the shelter. So this is all based on what you can reasonably observe or what you know. So a score of 0 is the woman does not personally report, and staff members have not observed any current concerns with physical health. And so the concerns with physical health could be really anything. It could range from, you know, really serious concerns, might be, you know, some long-term illness, maybe back pain, or even cancer or anything, something really, really serious. Or it could have well, not just, but some acute issues that she might be experiencing, maybe some treatable illness that's currently underway, that she needs support with, something that doesn't really interfere with her lifestyle. You might have, minor allergies. I would not include those. But something that does create issues for her, and maybe we can clarify that in the definitions. So a score of 0, you're not seeing any of those kinds of concerns. The score of 3, there are concerns, but they do not require any supports from shelter staff. So something is in place, but there's nothing you need to do about it because it's managed, or she has supports in place, or it's not sufficiently serious that you need to do anything about it. And 5 would mean some condition or problem is in place, but it does require something from you, requires that you help by either providing something on site or supporting with referrals, or anything that you need to do in shelter to support that issue, then you would give it a score of 5. So the number 19, injury resulting from abuse. So this, just like all those other questions we talked about, it's an additive question. So if somebody has an injury, then that person, we would score them either 3 or 5 under 18, right? Because they would have had a physical health issue. But we're adding a little bit more to the complexity if there's an injury that results from the abuse. So that's what that number 19 is about. Again, so if the woman doesn't report and staff members have not observed any physical injury, then it's a score of 0. If the woman reports or you observe it, but there is a physical injury but does not require treatment or hospitalization, that's a score of 3. And then again, there is an injury and it does require treatment, and does require your support, that's a score of 5. So then pregnancy is another very important issue for women in the shelter. Again, so if there is no pregnancy at all, then it's a score of 0. If there is a pregnancy, but there is no problems with it, so it's not a high-risk pregnancy, it's going as needed, as required, woman has everything addressed, it's all managed well, then it's a 3. Now, the next one is if she reports a history of high-risk pregnancy or has even one medical problem with the current pregnancy, obviously that would require support on the shelter end, then that's a score of 5. So I think I'll stop here again, just in case people might have some questions about this or mental health as well.
Do you have a question about injury resulting from abuse? Could this include children of the abused woman? For example, if a child she was pregnant with during the abuse had physical injury as a result of the abuse, would this be included in the scoring section?
Yeah, we actually have a section about children coming up. So that's where all of that information is going to be scored.
Perfect.
Allie, was the question that the injury occurred when the woman was pregnant, or the injury occurred to the child?
If the child she was pregnant with during the abuse had physical injury because of the abuse.
Okay, so it occurred when she was pregnant.
Yes.
Well, but so the injury resulting from abuse, she's coming into the shelter with an injury.
Right.
If the child has some physical issues because of that injury, then yes, we definitely want to know that. And that's in the section that speaks to the children and their health.
Perfect. Thank you. And with health issues, again, our shelter has a part-time nurse as our part of our program. She meets with all our residents. How does this factor into the scale? She also assists with immunization, advocacy, and health for two.
Yeah, I think that if there are some supports that shelter has to provide to address physical health, physical issues that a woman is experiencing, then it would be a score of 5, even if that's provided on site. But if it's the kind of health support that's what would you call that? Regular health maintenance, prevention? We would not mark it as physical health here, right? Because that's what this number 18 gets at is she's coming in with a physical issue of some kind. And what is it that we need to do to support that or not do? Is that
right? And so from what it sounds like, that the nurse there would see everyone just to do kind of a baseline check and see how everyone's doing. I would say then if in her check there's a woman that she discovered is diabetic or there's some ongoing health issue, then that would be a 5.
yes, that's correct. Yeah. But if they're doing say physicals, right? Woman comes in and the nurse provides a physical to her, and the woman does not report or there isn't any physical condition, then no, that would still be a 0.
Karen, I'm going to unmute you. Does that help clarify?
Yes, it does help. Thank you very much.
You're welcome, Karen.
So that's all the questions that we have right now, Irene.
Okay. So we'll move on now to, this is the children's section. So remember, there's 28 questions. So, okay, this goes over 2 pages, that's why. So we have children, and then we have one more section, and then that's the end of the scale. So this is all about children that the woman is admitted with. So the first, right off the top, the most important thing is to know that she might have children that are not with her, that are elsewhere, maybe with her parents or could be in care or something. We are only looking at children who are admitted with her, so that we can understand the complexity related to those children that she's living with. So number of children admitted, a score of 0 then is she's not admitted with any children. So that would be true for all of these questions. The score of 3 would be the woman is admitted with 1 to 3 children who are in her care, so between 1 and 3 children. And the score of 5, she has 4 or more children who are in her care. Then we're looking at obviously the more children, the more complex the situation. Then we're looking at age of children, and that has to do with the younger the child, the more complexity, and this we know from literature, and potential impact on the kids and the brain development, etc. So again, a score of 0 is the woman is not accompanied by any children. Score of 3, so now she has at least 1 child, and only one of these children is under age of 6. So she could have other school-age children, but only one of these children is under the age of 6. Right? So essentially, score of 3, she has children, and only one of them is the age of 6, or she has no children who are under the age of 6. A score of 5 is now she could have, 5 kids, at least 2 children is what the scale asks for, and at least 2 of them now are under the age of 6. So she could have 5 kids, 3 of them could be school age, but 2 would be under the age of 6. Or she could only have 2 kids and both of them would be under the age of 6. So that would still be the score of 5. That Makes sense. Okay. So Susan is nodding to say that was clear, but but sir, I know that sometimes it gets confusing. So please, if you have questions, do ask so we can talk about this some more and make it as clear as possible. So child mental, behavioral, or physical health concerns. So this is that question before about child sustaining an injury while the mom was pregnant. So this is where we would score it. So a score of 0 here would be there's no kids, or there is at least one child, but no children. There's no mental health or behavioral or physical health concerns related to any of these children. So essentially, there's no kids with any concerns, or no kids at all. A score of 3. So now she has children, and there are concerns. Anyone, behavioral, physical health, injuries, anything, concerns are in place. But like this is still the same formula that we've been using before, where an issue is in place, but it doesn't require support or management from the shelter. So this is what score of 3 really means. And the score of 5, there are concerns are in place, and these concerns do require support from shelter staff. Okay, child protection involvement. So again, if there's no children, that's a score of 0. Or if there are children, but there is no, so mom doesn't say there's any history, or you don't suspect, or you're not aware of any history. Again, quite possible that there might be a history and it just does not come out in your conversations, in which case you would score 0. So you can really only go on what you have, right? And you know, we're not asking you to continue asking women about this particular issue. You will just use your clinical judgment to decide when you have the information you need, or that that's all the information you're going to get. So score of 3 is, so there is some history, but there's no current involvement with child protection for any of the children. Okay? And then score of 5 means there could be history, maybe no history, but the main thing there is some kind of an active file with child protection. And then this last one, it kind of goes over to the other page, so I have to scroll down. Okay, so parenting stress index. So this has been a relatively recent tool that we've had agreement from the shelter directors that they will be using. So we are hoping that that is the case at all shelters. For case study purposes, it does not matter really, because we are going to give you the score in the case studies. But for the actual scoring, when we move into that process, what we'll be hoping to do is that parenting stress index is regularly used in the shelter. And of course, we have training available, and we can answer any questions with respect to it. So Susan can speak to parenting stress index and what it tells us, but essentially it's how much stress mom is experiencing as a result of parenting. And so the normal score is between the 16th and 84th percentile. So that would be the score of 0, or there's no kids. A score of 3 is now elevated score, so between 85 and 89th percentile. So what that means, one or more of the children might have a score like that. Okay. And then a score of 5 is significant clinical score, which is 90th percentile or higher, with 1 or more children.
Right, and for those of you that are using the parent stress index right now, it is to be used with children, or moms who have children between the ages of 18 months and 12 years. And what we're recommending is if she has more than one child, ideally we would ask her to complete it for each of the children, but know that they're very expensive. So it would be the child that she probably is struggling with the most, that she perceives as contributing to her stress as a parent, that she would complete that parent stress index. So it's really her perspective on looking at an individual child, so not all her children. So again, those of you that are using it know that there are various sub-scores with the parent stress index. And so it does give you some indications where mom might be experiencing the most stress. So if you are using it or you plan to use it and you need some training around that, just let me know.
Great, thanks, Susan. So I think I'm going to stop here, Ellie, for questions. It's quite a big section on kids. So just to review it again with people, you don't see the whole thing there, so I'm just going to move up a little bit. So we have the number of children admitted, age of children, child mental, behavioral, or physical health concerns, child protection involvement, and the one we can't see is the parenting stress index. So I'll just maybe take a minute, Ellie, and then we'll wait for you to let us know when we can move forward.
Sure. There's a question that goes back to the physical abuse
Okay.
and physical health. I have a client who's been strangled by her abuser. She has an eating disorder as well. For the eating disorder, would I check off physical health or injury resulting from abuse?
And so she has an eating disorder and she's been strangled. So I would for sure say that it's an injury resulting from abuse because she's been strangled. With eating disorder, so this is where, Susan, I probably need your help because that's a mental health issue.
I would consider that a mental health issue for sure, and I would make the assumption that it would involve some intervention or reports from the shelter, maybe a referral on. So that's where I would score it in the 2 places, because definitely strangulation is an injury, very serious. And yeah, eating disorder in my mind, it's like self-injury or any of those kinds of things. It's more of a mental health issue.
Perfect. Thank you. And there's a comment. We find the woman usually needs a lot of support for children not admitted. This includes family law matters and involvement with family members or ex-partners. Often we are also involved with child family services for those children not admitted. Usually this does add to the complexity of their stay. I understand that this is not what the question is asking. However, no admitted children often require a lot of advocacy and support.
Yeah, so that's a really good point, and I think we're going to make a note of that, and we are going to consider that in the next iteration of the scale, because that makes a lot of sense. What we're trying to get at is anything that requires additional work on behalf of the shelter, and we would be definitely missing that particular element here. So yeah, so we can maybe get add a question about something to do with the amount of work that shelter needs to do to support the non-admitted children, something like that. So thank you. Yes. And please, please again, there's going to be a place to make a note at the end of this scale when you complete it. Those would be like gold to us, those kinds of comments. So please put them down. You might think of more as you're doing it. That would be fantastic. So yeah, so if you can, we will note it, and if you can also note it or anything else you can think of once you start completing it, that would be great.
Thanks, Irene. Those are all the questions or comments that we have so far.
Okay. Do you think we should wait, Ellie, or move on?
Sorry, I muted myself. I think you can probably move on, and then you'll have one more at the end.
Yeah. Okay. So this is the last section. Sorry, I just need to fiddle with it a little bit here too. Okay, so so system involvement. So we've had an interesting question about this when people were actually doing a live test of the scale. And the question was, how is system involvement different from professional supports? So this is the difference, is in the professional supports, we try to get at how positive and effective those supports are. With system involvement, we're actually trying to get at the opposite, how much complexity those systems are adding, right? So just to get at, if you're involved with an immigration system, oh my goodness, there's a lot of problems and barriers you need to negotiate. Same with the legal system. And then we also have the overall system involvement, just to get a feel for how much work she has to do to, maintain her situation or manage where she's living or how she's managing. So 26, immigration status. Having an immigration status adds because you have to deal with the immigration system. So if someone is a Canadian citizen or permanent resident or a landed immigrant, that's a score of 0. Now, let me just say right away that it's, again, very similar to what we talked about when we talked about, the being on reserve, etc. That there could be people, and I think somebody said that, there could be people who are here for over 5 years, and, they're still really having a significant issue adjusting, and they can't speak the language, they don't have any sports, etc. And that yes, that's absolutely true. And again, this is just an additive question. So we do have a question about available supports. We do have a question about informal supports and professional supports. We do have a question about, how long they've been, but also their literacy and a language capacity. So those are all addressed somewhere else. So this one is just kind of an additive piece, that if you are a refugee, or if you have you're undeclared, you have no status, or you have temporary resident visa, you have some additional issues. So if you're a Canadian citizen, permanent resident, landed immigrant, score of 0, refugee, a score of 3, and then if you have a temporary visa or no status at all, or you're undeclared, score of 5, because obviously we know what kind of complexity might occur as a result of being in that situation. Legal issues. So a 0 is probably very unusual for women in shelters, in second stage shelters, where there are no legal issues that the woman is experiencing at all. But 3, she is experiencing legal issues, and I've given some examples of what those might be. And you might think of some others, and if you do, just let us know what maybe is missing. But those issues are well managed and do not require shelter staff support. So again, the same kind of formula as we've had before. There are issues in place, but they're well addressed, and there's nothing really that shelter needs to do to ensure that that can be moved forward. So the score of 5, then there are legal issues in place, and at least one of them requires shelter staff support. So she could be involved in a variety of different issues, but even if she needs an EPO or she needs an accompaniment to court or whatever, right, then that's a score of 5. Overall system involvement. So now what we want to kind of get a sense of is, in general, how much system negotiating does she have to do? And the systems we've identified are child protection, income support, justice, health, housing, education, or immigration. Again, if there's something we missed, please let us know in those notes. So a score of 0 would mean there's no involvement with any of those, which I really doubt would ever happen. But a score of 3 would be an involvement between 1 to 3 systems. So maybe she has, maybe she's on Alberta Works. Maybe she is trying to address her health issues. Maybe she's trying to get a degree or trying to apply back to school. So that now you're counting the number of systems that she's involved with. And if there's 1 to 3, then that's a score of 3. And then if there's lots more, so 4 or more systems, that's a score of 5. Again, just because it adds a huge amount of complexity to her life and also to your life as shelter support, because you have to now help her through all those systems. So that's the scale. And you see the box below for suggestions. I think we should make that box bigger. I'm going to make it bigger. But, you know, certainly if you have more suggestions, just the more the better. So if you need to write on the back of the paper, that's just fine too. So just this is where the value of your testing comes in, because then we get the feedback from the front lines and from your personal experience, and we want this to reflect your experience. So I think I'll stop here and again open it up for questions before we move on to our next little piece of presentation that speaks to actual completion of the review of the case study.
So
And
there was a question about going back to the children section.
Yeah.
Under the admitted children, how would you rate a grandmother who has a history of CW involvement, who has her grandchildren in her care or kinship?
Is she in the shelter? So we need, yeah, maybe if we
Some
can get
clarification.
yeah.
So then it would be grandma is admitted with 2 children, so I think then you would still.
Well, let's find out from.
Yeah.
Holly, I've unmuted you if you can provide a little bit of clarification. She has typed something that said yes in second stage.
Okay, so the grandmother is admitted with the, I think it was with 2 kids into second stage, and what was it? Sorry, could you read this question again for us?
Yes. Under the admitted children, how would you rate a grandmother who has had a history of CW involvement, who has her grandchildren in her care?
And she was admitted to the shelter. So then we're looking at number 24, child protection involvement. And then she has history. She's the person who's admitted with children. So that's who we're talking about. So it doesn't have to be the mom. It has to be the person who's admitted with children. So if she's admitted with children, then she has had history with either one of those specific children. So we're interested about the kids, not necessarily grandma's history with maybe some other kids, but those kids' history with child welfare. Then we're going to be scoring 3.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering if the children are with grandma because the mother, the child welfare, asked the grandmother to take the kids. You said a kinship order.
In which case, then the kids would have some kind of involvement
with child welfare.
With child welfare. And if the kinship order is underway right now at the time of admission, then that would be a score of 5.
Because we're looking at the children. So they're with the grandmother because maybe child welfare has deemed her to be a safer guardian to those children than the mother.
Yeah.
But it's an active file.
Yeah, yeah. And the shelter needs to acknowledge that and work with that.
Right.
Yeah.
Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. Okay. We didn't have any questions come in yet about the last section, so.
Okay, let's wait for a little bit then.
No other questions, Ally?
No other questions, so I think you're good to move on.
Okay, so we're just going to move you to a different document. Oops. Shooting. All right. So we're now moving on to the actual instructions for the completion of the scale. So the very first point here, we're talking about the training webinar, which is right now. What we are going to be sending this out to, we have a list of people from all shelters that have registered as scale completers, and we're looking at about 45 people. So you guys obviously have heard this, and we're going to send to everyone, yourselves included, if you want a refresher, a link to the recording, as Ally had said earlier, as well as it's going to be posted on YouTube so that you can always refer to the conversation. So this is, it's a requirement to participate in this training before completing the scale, and you can understand why. We need to make sure there's consistency and accuracy, and people have the same understanding of what the questions mean. So this is the first of the two testings. So what this means, what we're trying to do when we talk about testing, what this actually means is we want to see that, you know, if Susan and I were completing the scale, our scores are consistent. So if I think it's a 5, she also thinks it's a 5, right? So we want to, the testing looks for that kind of consistency. So then when you guys complete it, and the 45 of you complete it, we will be looking for correlation between the scores you provide. And that's why you'll see later on, we do not want you to be talking to each other about this when you complete the scale. We do not want you to be talking about the case studies that you will get or how you score it at all until after we've finished with the testing, so that we can get a true measure of consistency between people's ratings. So the other thing that I wanted to mention is there's going to be two testings. One way to test is to look at how Susan and I score between ourselves. The other way to test is whether or not I, myself, if I'm scoring, that if I score the case study today and I provide certain scores, those would be very similar scores to what I would do a month from now. In other words, how my day is going is not going to impact my scoring. So you will get the same package that we will send to you. So we'll send it today, the first package for the pre-test, and then we will send it again in February for you to do again. And that the purpose of that, it'll be the same case studies, and the purpose of that will be to see whether or not there's a consistency in how you score one day to another day. We will be sending in this package today 2 case study descriptions. They're each about 2 pages long. I don't want to put them up right now because I don't want the discussion about them. Again, for that same reason, I want this to be, well, it's really important that this be a real individual work and that you do not discuss it or your ratings. But Susan had actually put those together. And Susan has lots of experience in the shelter, and I thought that they were really well written and actually quite interesting to read, but they're not based on any actual clients, so this is kind of an aggregate of different cases and experiences. We're asking you that you read through them very carefully, because the care that you give to the reading of this and completing the scale will impact significantly on the type of on the testing results, obviously. So we do not want the results to be due to just somebody not having the time to do it and just doing it really quickly. instead of, you know, the actual scale, and what we need to do to change it and make it better. So another note here, please ensure to note the case study number on the Acuity forms. That's really important, so we know what you're scoring, so we can compare things correctly, as well as the date. The date is also important, because then we'll know if it's a pre-test or post-test. We said read the case studies carefully. Please also read the definitions carefully, and those are the definitions that we had just gone through. So before scoring, even if you think that you understand it totally, just make sure and read through it one more time to make sure that you're not missing anything. And of course, if you have any questions, please do call Susan, and she will, or email her, and she will address those for you. Do not ask your friends. Another thing to remember, your acuity assessment is going to be based on the woman's most recent admission to the second stage shelter, so not where she was in the emergency shelter or at some other admission. And that's very clear in the case study. Again, another important thing is to make the assessment based on the information provided in the study. So what had occurred last time we tried this is people started reading into it. Well, if she is, you know, if she has, I can't even remember a good example, but they just assumed that because she was looking for admission to second stage shelter, that she must have been in emergency shelter. Well, that wasn't necessarily the case in the case study. So you have to really just read through the case study and only base your assessment on what's written there. Of course, when we're dealing with case studies, it's very different than when you're dealing with real people. And so we are going to have another training once all of this is complete, and once we launch this using Outcome Tracker, so that everybody has, again, a refresher, as well as a good understanding of how to use the study in a real life situation. Okay, so here's that bullet point again that I've probably said already 50 times. So please do not discuss this with anyone, and don't discuss the ratings up until after you complete the post-test, until everybody completes the post-test, and you can at that point talk as much as you like with your other colleagues and compare notes. So in terms of the return of the scales, what we ask you to do is that you write your answers right on the scale, and then scan it, and then email it to both Susan and I, no later than January 31st. So this is for the pre-test. So you have about 12 days. Now, if it's totally unreasonable in terms of time and you're swamped with other things, please let us know, and we'll talk about other options. But that is what our preferred date is, because what we also need then to do is do the same administration in February, and we don't have a whole lot of time. And then for any questions, please contact Susan. So that's the, I hope I've gotten through all of that. So, but I'll stop now. And, you know, any questions at all, any comments, any suggestions, anything at all would be great.
Great, thank you, Irene and Susan. only comments coming through so far are just thank yous. And they say, excellent presentation.
Well, that's great. Thank you all, and thank you for such great questions. And again, really encourage you to please share your expertise and experience with us by noting any other additional comments or suggestions. You could certainly repeat the ones that you've provided today, which would be great, and any other new ones that will only help us make this scale better and also more useful to you once we start using it on a go-forward basis.
Yeah, and make sure if you do have questions, email me, susan@acws.ca, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. So thank you, everyone, for your time today.
Thank you, everyone. There should be a recording sent out to you in about an hour, I believe, is when the automated recording gets sent out. And if you don't receive it, just give me an email and I can pass it along.
Okay, so Ali, are you going to shut down or should I?
I can do that.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Ellie, for your support.
Yeah, thanks so much. That's
No
excellent.
problem. Have a good day.
Thanks, you too.